The frost came early to Vane Hall that year, settling into the mortar between the stones before the last leaves had properly fallen, and it did not leave again until spring. 7 of the house's 22 windows were shuttered from the inside, not because the rooms behind them held anything worth hiding, but because there was no coal to warm them, and an open window in winter was a vanity the house could no longer afford. 2 chimneys smoked in the mornings. The rest stood cold and black against a sky, the colour of dishwater. In the front hall, the long case clock that had once kept the hours for 3 generations of Vanes had stopped at 17 minutes past 4 some 4 years before, and no one had found the 10 shillings it would take a man from the village to come and mend it, so it stood there still, marking a single frozen moment while the rest of the house moved on without it. The good silver had gone to town in a locked box 18 months earlier, sold discreetly through a cousin who did not ask questions, and the 2 remaining housemaids had been let go the previous Michaelmas, their wages found at last only when it was time to say goodbye to them. What was left of the staff was, in practice, a single unmarried daughter of 22, a cook too old to be dismissed with a clear conscience, and a house that no longer troubled to hide, from anyone who looked closely enough, exactly how far the Vane family had fallen. Margaret Vane did not think of herself as poor. She thought of herself as busy, which was a kinder word and, to her mind, the truer one. On the morning the letter came announcing that His Grace the Duke of Thornebury would be arriving within the fortnight to discuss a matter of considerable importance to both families, Margaret was on her knees in the second-floor linen closet, counting candle stubs into a tin box by the grey light through an unshuttered window, because 11 candle stubs melted down together, made nearly 1 good candle, and 1 good candle unearned was a shilling not spent. She wore, that morning as most mornings, a grey muslin gown that had been dyed twice to hide its wear, and had faded through both dyes back toward its original colour, the hem let down once already, and now simply left short, because there was no more fabric to let down further. Over it she had tied an apron that had begun its life white, and was now the pale, uneven grey of a sky before snow. She did not think about any of this. She thought about candles, and about the fact that her father's guest was a duke, and that a duke arriving at a house with 2 smoking chimneys was rather like a swan arriving at a duck pond that had gone dry. Her elder sister Charlotte received the news of the duke's visit in the drawing-room, where a small fire had been permitted that morning on the strength of the letter alone, and her reaction was to set down her needlework, press both hands briefly to her collarbone, and say, in a voice pitched for effect rather than confidence, that she had known. She had simply known that their fortunes were about to turn. Charlotte was 24, golden-haired, and possessed of the particular beauty that improves with an audience, and she had spent the better part of 6 years being told by their father that she would marry well enough to save them all. A prophecy she had come to regard as a fact already accomplished, rather than a hope still owed. She did not ask what the Duke wished to discuss. She assumed, and her assumption filled the room like the smell of the good coal, that whatever it was, it concerned her. Their father, Sir Edmund Vane, read the letter a second time at the breakfast table, his spectacles slipping down a nose gone thin with worry, and said nothing at all about its contents to either daughter, which both of them understood, in their different ways, as confirmation that the matter was serious. He was not a cruel man. He was a frightened one, and frightened men make promises before they have decided how to keep them. It had been 3 years and 5 months since Margaret's mother died, and the house had not, in any sense that mattered, been properly warm since. Margaret still counted the time that way, in years and months, rather than as a single fixed date, because a date could be forgotten, and a length of time could not. Not when it was measured out daily in cold hallways and empty chairs. She rose each morning before the rest of the house at 5:45, dressed by the grey light because a candle at that hour was a shilling she would rather keep, and went first to the kitchen, where old Mrs. Pruitt the cook kept the one fire in the house that was never allowed to go entirely out, and together the two of them planned a day's meals out of whatever the larder still permitted. Margaret's hands by then knew the whole house the way a blind man knows a familiar room, which floorboard in the upstairs corridor gave a low, complaining creak that could wake her father, which door in the east wing no longer closed all the way and let a draught through that could, on the coldest nights, be heard moving down the passage like something with a voice of its own. She had mended the same 3 gowns so many times that she no longer thought of the mending as a chore, but simply as a kind of conversation she carried on with the fabric. Each new stitch a small correction to what time and washing had worn away. She did not resent any of it. She had simply never been given the leisure to imagine that her days might be spent otherwise, and a person who has never imagined an alternative rarely mourns its absence. The Duke's carriage lost a wheel on the rutted lane 2 miles short of Vane Hall, on a morning of standing cold and hard white sky, 4 days earlier than his letter had promised, because he had finished his business in the county sooner than expected, and had seen no reason to sit idle in an inn when he might simply arrive and be done with the whole unpleasant errand. Julian Ashford, 9th Duke of Thornebury, was 31 years old, unmarried, and possessed of an income that made him, by any reasonable measure, one of the most eligible men in England, a fact he had come to regard with the flat weariness of a man who has been offered the same meal at every table he has ever sat down to. He left his driver with the broken wheel and walked the last 2 miles on foot, in a plain dark coat with no crest upon it, because he had learned young that a title worn too visibly drew out in people a version of themselves he had no wish to meet. He arrived at Vane Hall an hour before any servant had thought to watch for him, and there being no footman to receive him at a door that had not employed a footman in 3 years, he knocked, and waited, and knocked again. And it was Margaret who answered, still in her grey gown and her greyer apron, a smear of candle tallow on one wrist and a torn seam at her left shoulder where the fabric had given way that very morning as she reached for the linen closet shelf, a small tear she had meant to mend before anyone saw it, and had not yet had the chance to. She looked at the man on the step, plainly dressed, travel-worn, his boots carrying 2 miles of frozen mud, and took him without a second thought for the land agent her father had been expecting about the matter of the eastern fields, a man of business come early and unannounced, exactly the sort of visitor who arrived at back doors in coats with no crest. She did not curtsy. She said that Sir Edmund was from home until noon, but that she could have someone see to the gentleman's boots and bring tea to the small parlour, since the good parlour's fire had not yet been laid, and would he mind waiting there? Julian, who had spent a decade having his boots seen to by men trained never to look him in the eye, found himself looking at a young woman with a torn shoulder and tallow on her wrist, who looked directly back at him, without deference and without apology, and said he would not mind at all. He watched her, in the 20 minutes that followed, doing 3 things at once, with the unhurried competence of a woman who had long since stopped finding her own labour remarkable. She laid the small parlour fire herself, kneeling on the cold hearthstone, coaxing a flame from kindling that had clearly been rationed, and she carried in tea that was, he noted, weak, the leaves plainly used a second time, and she apologized for neither. She spoke to him twice more, once to ask whether he took sugar. There was very little, she said, without embarrassment, only fact, and once to excuse herself, saying the cook needed her in the kitchen, and that Sir Edmund's own daughter, meaning herself, though she did not say so directly, would see that he was not neglected. He watched her go. She moved through the cold house the way a person moves through a room they have measured with their whole body 1,000 times, sure-footed even where the carpet had worn through to the boards beneath, and he found himself, for the first time in longer than he cared to examine, curious about a person he had assumed, from her dress and her manner, to be a servant. He had not always held women at the careful, measuring distance he now kept as a matter of habit. At 24, he had believed himself in love with a baronet's daughter named Henrietta Fell, a bright, laughing girl who had seemed, for the better part of a year, to want nothing from him but his company, and he had gone so far as to speak to her father before he learned, from a careless remark she made to a friend that was repeated back to him by a third party who thought he ought to know, that she had confided to that same friend, 6 months earlier, her private calculation of exactly how many years she expected to wait before he inherited, and what an inheritance of that size might reasonably be expected to purchase. He had not confronted her. He had simply stopped calling, and had watched, with a coldness that surprised even himself, as she transferred her bright laughter within the season to a viscount 2 years his senior, with considerably less patience for waiting. He had told himself since that the lesson had cost him little, a bruised vanity, and nothing more. But 7 years on, he still measured every drawing-room he entered by the same private arithmetic, watching for the particular quality of attention that turned, however subtly, toward the size of an estate, rather than the man standing on it. He had grown, without quite intending it, into a man who trusted a woman's indifference far sooner than her warmth. It was, he sometimes thought, a poor way to go through a life, but it had at least the virtue of rarely disappointing him, and a girl in a torn grey gown, unaware that the man she had left waiting with weak tea was a duke at all, had just done something no calculating woman would ever have troubled to do. She had treated a stranger she believed to have nothing to offer her exactly as well as she would, he suspected, have treated a king. It was Sir Edmund, returning at noon and discovering with something close to physical pain that his daughter had left the Duke of Thornebury waiting an hour in the small parlour with weak tea and a fire she had laid herself, who supplied the correction. He came in already apologizing, already reaching for the practiced warmth of a man greeting a fortune, and it was in the doorway, hearing her father say, "Your Grace, forgive us, we did not expect you until Thursday," that Margaret understood. With a small cold drop in her stomach, very like stepping into water she had thought was shallow, exactly whom she had been serving tea. She stood very still in the parlour doorway. Her chin, which had been level all morning, came up 1/2 inch, not in defiance, but in the particular readiness of a person deciding not to be ashamed of an honest morning's work. She did not apologize for the tea. She said only, "Your Grace," and inclined her head, and left the room, and it was the not apologizing, more than anything that had come before it, that Julian found himself thinking of for the rest of that day. Sir Edmund's business, laid out that evening over a dinner assembled with more urgency than resources, was this, that his debts, accumulated across a decade of bad harvests and worse investments, now stood at a sum he could not discharge, and that a distant connection of his late wife's family had brought him, some months before, an unlikely proposal, that the Duke of Thornebury, whose own estate bordered 3 of Sir Edmund's remaining farms, and who had long wished to consolidate the land between them, might be persuaded toward a marriage alliance that would clear the debt entirely and settle a fair portion besides. Sir Edmund had understood the proposal, from the first whispered word of it, to concern Charlotte, and he said as much across the table with the particular confidence of a man who has already spent money he does not yet have, gesturing toward his elder daughter with a small proud tilt of his head, as though presenting a horse he was certain would place well. Charlotte, for her part, spent the dinner arranging herself to advantage, laughing a half-beat too readily at anything the Duke said that might charitably be called wit, and twice, when Margaret rose to see to the removal of a dish, because there was no footman to do it, made some light remark about her sister's usefulness in the kitchen that was not quite unkind enough to answer, and not quite kind enough to overlook. Julian, watching this over the rim of a glass of wine that was, like the tea, thinner than it should have been, said little. He had by then a decade's experience of women arranging themselves toward his fortune, and he watched Charlotte do it with the flat, private cynicism of a man checking off a list he had seen written out many times before. He held, and had held for some years, the settled conviction that marriage, for women of Charlotte's sort and situation, was purely a transaction dressed in the language of feeling, that a woman's warmth toward him was reliably proportional to the size of his estate, and that he would very likely go to his grave having never once been looked at by a woman with a reason to want him in any way that was not at bottom a calculation. It was not a happy belief. It had simply never yet been disproven. He noticed, too, without at first understanding why he noticed it, that Margaret Vane, when she was not rising to fetch something no one else thought to fetch, sat very straight, in a gown that had clearly been let down, and taken up and let down again, and that when Charlotte made her small remark about the kitchen, something in Margaret's shoulders did not move at all, held with the particular stillness of a person who has trained her own body not to answer. Later that same evening, when the plates had been cleared and Sir Edmund had drawn the Duke aside to speak of the eastern fields, Charlotte found a moment alone with her sister in the passage outside the dining-room, and said, not unkindly exactly, but not gently either, that Margaret oughtn't to trouble herself so over impressing a duke, since men of that sort generally knew what they were about, and would hardly be swayed one way or another by who carried in the tea. Margaret said only that she had not been trying to impress anyone, that someone had needed to carry in the tea, and she had simply been nearest the kitchen, and Charlotte, with the particular laugh she reserved for remarks she considered charmingly modest rather than simply true, said that Margaret really oughtn't to be so hard on herself. It was not her fault she had never learned to want more. Some women simply were not made for it, and swept back into the drawing-room before Margaret could decide whether the words had been meant as comfort or as something considerably less kind, wearing comfort's clothes. Margaret stood alone in the passage a moment, her hand finding the thimble in her apron pocket without her quite deciding to reach for it, and told herself, as she often did, that there was no profit in minding it. We will take a very short break. If you do not want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The proposal, when Sir Edmund finally made it plain some days later in his study, was not for Charlotte at all. Julian had asked, with the flat directness of a man accustomed to being obeyed rather than persuaded, to speak with Margaret, not Charlotte, on the matter of marriage, and Sir Edmund's face had gone through 3 expressions in as many seconds. Confusion, then something like alarm then, as the arithmetic of debts and daughters resolved itself in his mind. A relief so plain it was nearly indecent. Because a duke was a duke, whichever daughter he chose, and the debt would be cleared either way. He did not think to ask Margaret whether she wished it. He sent for her instead, as one sends for a servant to confirm an instruction already given, and it was in that summons, more than in anything the Duke himself had said, that Margaret first understood the precise shape of the bargain being made around her, as though she were a field to be consolidated along with the 3 farms. She came into her father's study still in her grey gown, the torn shoulder mended now with small, exact stitches that matched the fabric closely enough that only a person looking for them would find them, and she listened to her father explain, in the eager, unsteady voice of a drowning man describing a rope, that his Grace had done them the very great honour of proposing marriage, that the debt would be settled entirely, that this was, in short, the salvation of the family, and she listened to all of it, with her hands folded in front of her and her chin level, and when he had finished she said, quite calmly, that she would like a quarter of an hour to speak with his Grace alone. Sir Edmund began to object that this was not how such matters were conducted, and Julian, watching Margaret's face rather than her father's, said that he thought a quarter of an hour a very reasonable request, and that he would be glad to grant it. Alone in the small parlour where she had once served him weak tea without knowing his name, Margaret stood by the cold hearth. There was no fire laid that afternoon, no one having yet remembered to lay one, and said that she would not pretend to be flattered by an offer that had, by her father's own account, been made first to her sister, and redirected to her only once her sister's manner had failed to please, and that she would not marry a man, duke or otherwise, in order to be a decoration purchased along with 3 farms and settled quietly into a great house to be admired and otherwise ignored. She said this without raising her voice. She counted, silently, 3 seconds of his silence before she went on, because she had learned that a person who fills every silence with more words has already lost the negotiation, and in the space of those 3 seconds she watched something in his face that was not offence, but something closer to attention. The look of a man, hearing, for the first time in longer than he could easily say, a sentence he had not already anticipated the shape of. She told him, then, precisely what she required, if he wished her answer to be yes, that she would have the management of the household accounts at Thornebury in her own name, not as a courtesy, but as a settled right, that she would have a fixed and independent income of her own, sufficient that she need never ask him for a shilling as one asks a favour, that she would be permitted to establish and direct, without interference, some charitable undertaking of her own choosing. She had in mind, she said, a school for the tenant children, having taught her own younger cousins their letters at this very table for want of a governess her father could not afford, and that whatever affection might or might not grow between them, she would not be married for the purpose of being decorative, and she would know within the year whether he had married her for the land alone or for something nearer to respect. She said all of this looking directly at him, her hands still folded, her voice steady, and when she had finished, she did not soften it with an apology, as Charlotte would have done, as most women he had known would have done, folding the demand back into something more palatable the moment it left their lips. Julian was silent, longer than 3 seconds this time. He found, examining the feeling with the same private, cynical care he examined most things, that he was not offended at all. He was, instead, something nearer to relieved, as a man is relieved to be told plainly what a bargain will cost rather than discover the true price only after the contract is signed. He said that her terms were reasonable, and that he would agree to every one of them in writing before any vows were spoken, and something in his hand, resting on the cold mantel, moved half an inch toward her before he caught it and let it fall still again, a gesture so small she did not see it, though he felt it happen. The first almost of many that were to follow. The betrothal was announced within the fortnight, and the settlement, drawn up precisely as Margaret had specified, was witnessed and signed in the same small parlour, on the same cold hearth, where she had once brought him tea without knowing his name, and had, some weeks later, told him without flinching what she would and would not accept. She had throughout kept in her apron pocket a small object she carried everywhere and rarely spoke of, a silver thimble, worn thin at the crown from decades of use, engraved along its narrow band with the initials E.V. And the year 1791, which had belonged to her mother, and to her mother's mother before that, 3 generations of Vane women having mended their families' fortunes, quite literally, stitch by stitch, with that same thimble on the same finger. She had it with her the day she served the tea. She had it with her the day she stated her terms. It sat now, cool and familiar, against her palm as she signed her own name to the settlement, and she thought, briefly and without sentiment, that her mother would have understood exactly what she had asked for, and why. The walled kitchen garden at Vane Hall had gone to seed some 4 years before, its beds overrun with couch grass, its espaliered pear trees unpruned and reaching wild against the south wall, because there had been no gardener's wages to spare, and no daughter with time enough to tend both a household and an acre of ground besides. It was Julian, in the weeks of the betrothal, who first noticed it, walking the grounds one grey afternoon while waiting for Sir Edmund to finish some business in the village, and it was Julian who asked Margaret, with a directness that surprised them both, whether she had ever tended it herself, and whether she missed it. She said that she had, as a girl, and that she did, and thought no more of the conversation until 3 days later a man arrived from Thornbury with tools and cuttings and a letter in Julian's own hand instructing that the garden be restored under Miss Vane's direction, and no one else's. She stood at the gate the morning the work began, her hand resting on the old iron latch, and felt something in her chest that she did not, at the time, have a word for, and did not need one, because the garden said it for her. Julian came often after that, ostensibly to inspect the work, and it became, without either of them naming it as such, a settled habit that he would arrive an hour before dinner and find her among the beds, her sleeves pushed back, directing the placement of a cutting or arguing gently with the hired man about the pruning of the pears, and he would stand at the low gate rather than come further in, watching her a full minute before she noticed him. Because he had discovered that he liked, more than he had expected to like anything, simply watching her work before she knew she was watched. On one such evening, the light going long and gold across the wall, she straightened from the bed she had been weeding and found him already there, and something crossed his face. She could not afterward say precisely what, only that his mouth moved as though it meant to become a smile, and then thought better of it, catching itself half-formed, the way a man catches a word before he says it aloud. She asked him once, lightly, whether he found weeding as interesting as he seemed to, standing at that gate evening after evening, and he said, after a pause just long enough to notice, that he had found a great many things more interesting since arriving at Vane Hall than he had expected a fortnight in the country to hold, and did not say what, precisely, he meant, though his eyes did not leave her face as he said it, and his hand, resting on the top rail of the gate, tightened there as though it wished to reach further, and had decided, for the moment, not to. They spoke, in those evenings, of small things rather than large ones, of the pear trees and their proper pruning, of the school she meant to start for the tenant children once she had the means, of a book of sermons her mother had left her, that she had never once opened because she could not bear, she admitted once without quite meaning to see her mother's hand in the margins, and know there would be no more of it. Julian listened to this last confession with a stillness she had not seen in him before, and said only that he understood a house could hold its dead in very small places, a chair, a book, a room no one used, and that he did not think there was any shame in leaving some doors closed until a person was ready to open them herself. It was the nearest either of them had come, in all their careful negotiations, to speaking plainly of grief, and Margaret found that she trusted him rather more for having said it than for anything he had promised her in writing. It was in that garden, some weeks later, on an afternoon when the first pear blossom had opened white against the grey wall, that Lady Priscilla Colworth came to call, ostensibly to offer her felicitations on the coming marriage, and in truth to see, with her own eyes, the woman who had been chosen over her own carefully cultivated hopes. Lady Priscilla was 30 years old, elegant in the particular hard-edged way of a woman who has spent a decade being told she was nearly, but not quite, the most eligible match in 3 counties, and she had watched, 4 years earlier, the one man she had genuinely wished to marry choose someone else entirely, and had since then attached her ambitions instead to Julian, quietly, patiently, certain that her own bloodline and beauty made the outcome only a matter of time. She stood at the edge of the restored beds in a walking dress the colour of good claret, and she looked at Margaret's hands, still faintly marked with garden soil, and said, in a voice pitched low enough that only Margaret would hear it, that it was really quite remarkable what a duke's money could dress up as a duchess these days, and that she did hope Margaret understood the difference between being chosen and being convenient, because so very few women in her position ever did. Margaret said nothing to this. She held the thimble in her apron pocket, her fingers finding its familiar shape without her quite meaning to reach for it, and when Lady Priscilla had gone, sweeping back down the garden path with the satisfaction of a woman who believes she has planted something that will grow, Margaret stood a long moment among the pear blossoms and let her back straighten by the smallest possible degree, refusing, in the particular silent way she had of refusing things, to let the words take root where the woman had meant them to. The gossip began within a fortnight of Lady Priscilla's visit, moving through the drawing-rooms of the county with the particular speed of a rumour that answers a question people were already curious about. It was said, first quietly, and then not quietly at all, that the Duke of Thornebury's bride had been discovered by him wearing a maid's uniform, that she had, by some accounts, actually been in service before her father's fortunes obliged the story to be dressed up as an eldest daughter's fall from grace, that no one had properly verified the Vane family's claim to gentility at all, and that a man of Julian's standing had very likely been deceived, or worse, had known perfectly well and simply not cared, which several ladies of the ton agreed was, if anything, more scandalous still. Margaret heard the first version of it from Charlotte, who reported it with a carefulness that did not entirely disguise a certain satisfaction, and heard the second version of it 3 days later, from her own reflection in a shop window in the village, where 2 women she did not know were discussing, in voices not troubling to be quiet. Whether the Duke's intended had truly been found at the servants' entrance in an apron. The seed of it, though no one in the county would ever trace it back so precisely, had been planted a full month earlier, on the very afternoon of Lady Priscilla's call in the walled garden, in a private remark made not to Margaret at all, but to her own lady's maid on the carriage ride home. A single sentence spoken almost carelessly, that it might be amusing, might it not, if certain persons of quality came to understand exactly what sort of woman the Duke of Thornebury had chosen to elevate above them, and that a maid's memory, once properly encouraged with a few coins, was a wonderfully accommodating thing. It was, by the standards of the ton, barely cruelty at all, a private word dropped into a private ear, invisible to everyone but the reader who had watched it planted and now watched it, weeks later, bloom into something that could no longer be traced back to any single hand. Charlotte, for her own part, did not deny the rumour when it reached her, and did not precisely confirm it either, which amounted, in a house as small as theirs, to very much the same thing. She said, when Margaret asked her directly whether she had said anything to encourage it, that she supposed people would talk however they pleased, regardless of what anyone said or did not say, and that Margaret oughtn't to take it all so much to heart. Delivered in the particular tone of a woman who has decided that her sister's difficulty is, on balance, rather easier to bear than her own continued disappointment would have been. She did not cry. She had a rule, long settled and never spoken aloud even to herself, that tears changed nothing. That she had watched her own mother weep over her father's debts for a decade, and watched the debts remain entirely unmoved by the weeping, and so she had decided, somewhere in the years since, that whatever else she might permit herself, she would not permit that. That night, alone in her room, she took the silver thimble from her apron pocket and held it a long while in the candlelight, turning it so the worn initials caught and lost the flame, and she thought of the room at the end of the hall that had been her mother's, which no one had properly used in the 3 years and 5 months since her death, the fire never lit there now. The chair still turned toward the window, as it had been turned the last afternoon her mother sat in it. The room was still warm. Margaret had thought once, foolishly going in some days after the funeral, as though warmth might have lingered the way grief did. It had not been warm at all. It had simply still felt, in every particular, exactly as it had been left, which was its own kind of cold. The book of sermons still lay on the small table by the chair, open to the same page it had been open to on the last morning her mother read it, and no one, in all the month since, had so much as closed it, as though closing it might make the leaving final in a way that leaving it open somehow did not. Margaret rose before dawn that night, unable to sleep, and walked the cold corridor to that room, and stood a long while in the doorway without going in, as she had done perhaps a dozen times in 3 years, and did not fully understand why she still did it. She thought of what Lady Priscilla had said in the garden, and what the 2 women in the shop window would go on saying whether she wept over it or not, and she thought that her mother, who had mended 3 generations' worth of misfortune with nothing but a needle and a steady hand, would not have wasted a single tear on a woman like Lady Priscilla Colworth, would instead have straightened her back and gone on with the day's work, because that, in the end, was the only answer either of them had ever found that actually changed anything. She set the thimble down at last, on the small table beside her own bed rather than back in her apron pocket, a small, deliberate act she could not entirely explain even to herself, and did not cry, and told herself this was strength, and did not entirely believe it. Julian, hearing the gossip through channels of his own, found Margaret in the garden 2 mornings later, kneeling at the edge of the restored bed with her sleeves pushed back and soil under her nails, and stood at the gate without coming further in. The way he had stood, without quite realizing he was measuring it, at the edge of every room she occupied since the day he first mistook her for a stranger's servant, and found himself unable to stop thinking of her afterward. He told her what was being said. He watched her back straighten, that same small half-inch he had noticed before, and he said, before she could answer, that none of it mattered to him, that he did not care in the least whether she had once worn an apron, that a woman who could lay a fire and manage a failing household and state her own terms without flinching was worth 10 of the women who had spent their whole lives being told they need never lift a finger. He came, as he said it, 2 steps further into the garden than he had ever come before, close enough now that neither of them noticed, until later that the old careful distance between them had quietly closed, and for 1 full second, then a second more, then a third, neither of them spoke at all. And it was Julian, in the 3rd second, who reached out and did not stop his own hand this time, and touched, briefly and without asking permission, the soil-marked back of hers where it rested on the garden wall. The confrontation Lady Priscilla had been patiently constructing came to its point at the Ashworth ball 3 weeks later, the largest gathering of the season, held in a house ablaze with candlelight from 100 sconces, every window unshuttered, every fire built high, the whole night lit as if to banish, deliberately, every shadow the county's gossip had tried to grow in the dark. Margaret wore, that night, a gown of pale blue silk that Julian had insisted upon, cut simply, without ornament she did not choose herself, and she stood near the edge of the ballroom with the thimble, absurdly, tucked into the small silk reticule at her wrist, because she had carried it to every important moment of the last 4 months, and had not thought that evening to leave it behind. Lady Priscilla found her near the refreshment table, and this time she did not lower her voice at all. She said, loudly enough for a dozen heads to turn, that she had heard the most extraordinary thing, that a maid's uniform, torn at the shoulder, had been found and kept by a servant at Vane Hall, who swore it belonged to the very woman now claiming to be a duke's bride. And she produced, from a small case she had brought for exactly this purpose, a scrap of grey fabric with a mended tear at the shoulder that matched, with theatrical precision, the shoulder of the gown Margaret had worn the very first morning Julian arrived at Vane Hall. The room went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when it senses that something real is about to happen, rather than merely something entertaining. Margaret felt her own pulse in her throat, and felt, too, the old familiar instruction rise in her. Say nothing. Endure it. Tears change nothing. And for 1 moment, one single unwatched moment, her chin dropped, her eyes went bright, and her hand closed hard around the thimble in her reticule as though it alone might hold her upright. 1 second passed, then a second more, then a third, the small orchestra somewhere behind her still playing the tail end of a country dance, as though nothing at all had happened, and in that 3rd second Margaret felt something shift inside her chest that was not quite courage and not quite anger, but a close cousin of both, and her chin came back up, and she opened her mouth to answer Lady Priscilla herself, before she needed anyone else to answer for her. She said, in a voice that did not carry the whole room, but carried far enough, that the gown was indeed hers, that she had worn it the morning she laid a fire with her own hands, because there had been no servant left in her father's house to lay it for her, and that she was not ashamed of a single stitch of it, nor of the hands that had mended it, nor of the years of work that had kept a roof over a family Lady Priscilla had never once troubled herself to understand. It was, for a moment enough, a ripple went through the nearest onlookers, the particular ripple of a room reconsidering, mid-breath, which of the two women standing before them had actually behaved with more dignity, and it was into that reconsidering silence that Julian's footsteps sounded, unhurried, across the ballroom floor. It was Julian who crossed the room. He did not hurry, and he did not raise his voice, but every person present understood, from the particular quality of his silence as he came, that something decisive was about to be said. He stood beside Margaret, close enough that the old measured distance between Duke and household was plainly and publicly gone, and he addressed the room rather than Lady Priscilla alone. He said that the gown in Lady Priscilla's hand was, in fact, the very gown Margaret Vane had been wearing the morning he arrived unannounced at her father's door, and that he would tell them plainly what he had seen that morning, since apparently no one else in the room had troubled to ask him. He had seen a young woman lay her own fire on a freezing morning, rather than let a guest sit cold, share what little tea her household possessed without apology or excuse, and speak to a stranger she believed beneath her own consideration with exactly the same courtesy she would later show a duke. Because her courtesy, unlike so much he had encountered in these very rooms, had never once depended on knowing what a person could do for her. He said that he had since watched her manage a household's accounts with more sense than most men twice her age, restore a garden with her own hands until it bloomed again after 4 years of neglect, teach tenant children their letters at her own table because no governess had ever been sent to do it for her, and state her own terms for marriage to his face without once softening them to please him, and that these, and not her father's title nor her dress upon any particular morning, were the qualities he had chosen when he chose her. He said, further, that he had come to this house a man who believed a woman's warmth toward him could never be trusted to mean anything beyond what his fortune might purchase, and that Margaret Vane, in a torn grey gown on a morning she believed him a stranger, with nothing to offer her, had proven that belief false before she ever learned his name, which was, he told the room plainly, a gift he did not know how a man properly repaid, except by standing here now and saying so. He turned then to Lady Priscilla herself, and his voice did not rise, though the room had gone entirely still to hear it. He said that he happened to know, from a conversation he had not sought, but had certainly overheard some months before at his own club, that Lady Priscilla's own family fortune stood considerably less secure than the county believed, that a certain gentleman's debt owed to her late father remained unpaid and quietly threatened, and that a woman standing on ground that thin might do well to consider how loudly she wished to speak of other people's uniforms. He did not say it to wound her further than the moment already had. He said it rather the way a man points out a truth he suspects has been privately weighing on someone far longer than they have ever admitted aloud. And there was, beneath the correction, something almost like sympathy in it, an acknowledgement that a woman does not spend 30 years sharpening herself into a weapon without first having been left by someone badly afraid. He did not say this cruelly. He said it the way one closes a door rather than slams it, and the room understood, in the silence that followed, exactly what had been closed. Lady Priscilla's face, for 2 full seconds, came entirely apart, the practiced smoothness cracking all at once into something raw and frightened and very young. The face of a woman who has spent 30 years being told that her worth was conditional, and has just watched the condition called due in front of everyone she knows. And then, with a skill it had plainly taken years to learn, she put the face back together, inclined her head with brittle correctness, and said that she wished the couple every happiness, and withdrew. Margaret, watching her go, felt the anger that had been building in her chest through every gossiping week soften, unexpectedly, into something closer to pity. And she crossed the small remaining distance and said, quietly, so that only Lady Priscilla could hear, that she was welcome at Thornbury any time she cared to call, that whatever had passed between them tonight need not be the last word, and that the door, at least on Margaret's side of it, would remain open. Lady Priscilla did not answer. She did not, that night, walk back through it, but she did not, either, refuse the offer outright, and something in her stiff shoulders, as she disappeared into the crowd, suggested that the door had at least been noticed. Julian turned back to Margaret in the sudden, ringing quiet of the ballroom, and said, loudly enough now for the whole room to hear, what he had not yet said to her directly in all the months of their careful, negotiated engagement, that he loved her, not for the land their marriage would consolidate, nor for the debt it would clear, but for exactly the qualities he had just named before witnesses, and that he would go on loving her whether she wore silk or grey muslin, or a torn apron with tallow on her wrist, because he had learned, watching her, that a person's worth was never once written in her clothes. Margaret felt the tears come then, at last, unbidden and entirely unstoppable, and she let them, standing in the full candlelight of a room with not a single shuttered window in it, and understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that these were not the tears her old rule had been made to guard against. These changed nothing that needed changing. They were simply, for the first time in longer than she could remember, tears of joy, and she let them fall. 6 months later, Thornbury's walled garden stood fully restored, the pear trees pruned into their old espaliered lines against sun-warmed stone, the beds thick with the particular abundance of a summer that has been properly tended from its first cold morning. And Margaret sat on the low stone bench at its centre, in a plain muslin gown, chosen for comfort rather than occasion, a small school ledger open on her knee, recording the names of the 11 tenant children who now came 3 mornings a week to learn their letters at the long table she had once used to teach her own younger cousins. The old silver thimble sat now, not in an apron pocket, but set into a small glass case on the mantel of her own private sitting-room, retired at last from daily use, and given instead a place of honour, its worn initials catching the afternoon light through a window that stood, as every window at Thornbury now stood in summer, entirely unshuttered. A letter had come that very morning, brought up from the village with the rest of the post, bearing Lady Priscilla Colworth's careful hand, thanking Margaret for an invitation extended some weeks before, and accepting it at last, with a stiffness that had not entirely left her phrasing, but was, Margaret thought, reading it twice over her morning tea, a beginning none the less. Doors, she had told her once in a ballroom blazing with candlelight, do not close themselves simply because a person is slow to walk through them. And it seemed, 6 months on, that the door left open in that ballroom had not, after all, been left open for nothing. Julian found her there as the light was going gold, and sat beside her on the sun-warmed stone with the particular ease of a man who no longer measured the distance between himself and the person beside him. and asked, as he often did now, whether she had grown tired yet of proving him wrong about everything he had once believed of marriage. She said, as she always did, that she had not, and that she did not intend to, and reminded him, with the small private smile she kept only for this particular jest between them, that she had told him so herself in a cold parlour with a cold hearth. The very first afternoon he had asked what terms would satisfy her, and that a man who did not care to be proven wrong ought never to have agreed to her conditions in writing. He said that it was, he had since decided, the finest bargain he had ever struck, and reached for her hand, not almost, not half a gesture caught and abandoned, but fully, easily, the way a man reaches for something he has long since stopped being afraid to want, and she let him take it. And somewhere beyond the garden wall a child's laughter carried across the warm evening air, and neither of them moved to go inside. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you are watching from, and what the story made you feel. Do not forget to subscribe so you will not miss new stories.